All right. Hi, I am here with my old friend and former colleague, John Mead, who is the Eugene McDermott Master Teacher Chair in Science at the St. Mark's School of Texas. Hi, John.
Hey, nice to be here, and thanks for taking the time to talk with me. And it's good to get to meet a bunch of new students through this.
My pleasure. I think they're pretty excited to hear about what you do. So, I guess what I like to do with these interviews is start off pretty early, right? Like what first, so this is our class is ecology and evolution. So, big picture, what first got you interested in biology and evolution type stuff?
For me, I'd say there are two things. The first thing is I grew up in a medical family. I would have been the fifth generation in my family to have been a physician. So I grew up around medicine. I went as a middle schooler, yeah, heck, even as an elementary schooler, I would go on rounds with my dad to the hospital in New York City where we grew up. And so that was kind of second nature to me. I remember as probably a fourth or fifth grader looking at histology slides in his lab and helping to do blood counts.
Yeah.
So I got that feel early on.
Sure.
Later in high school, when I got to actually sit in on surgery and help out as a intern, not a true medical intern, but as a kind of a unpaid, help out kind of person.
Yep.
I found out medicine probably wasn't for me, mostly because I saw that the people I was dealing with, mostly medical students, were so competitive that they lost, I felt, a lot of their compassion. And it became about getting, I have to get this procedure in, I have to get this procedure in. It wasn't about taking care of the patients. And so that kind of turned me off on that. Then the flip side, my interest in evolution came, I remember some of my earliest book memories are having a copy of the Time Life Nature series, which was, for your students are too young to appreciate this, but it was kind of a library that you'd get from TV, and they'd have a series of maybe 10 books in a deal. And this was the Nature and Science Library, and there was one called Early Man, and it was all these pictures and stuff. And even though I couldn't read, it became my Linus's security blanket, and I'd carry that around. And then by about middle school, I found Lucy, Don Johansson's book, and wound up reading that. And again, it was pretty much most of it was over my head, but the story of it, the excitement, certainly tied into me, and that got me hooked, and I've been hooked ever since.
Well, I didn't know that your interest in hominid early man goes back that far. That's really interesting.
It started early.
Cool. And I also think, just so my class this year is about 160 students, and most of them are pre-med. So at this point, most of them are thinking about careers in medicine, but I know that a lot of them at this point in their academic career start to think about whether that's really what they want to do or not. So part of this is to share a diverse set of pathways through biology careers. So then how did you get from that early interest to teaching?
Okay, so by the time I attended Duke University, by the way, Duke will be playing later tonight, so go Blue Devils. I was kind of turned off on medicine by the time I got to college. Had an interest in biology in general and ecology more specifically, and had some great professors there. And I thought, okay, maybe I'll wind up going into research. And as I got to know more graduate students, I saw that, oh boy, that felt like kind of a grind. That again, it got away from the passion of the topic. And I saw the struggle for funding and the like. And I was in college in the kind of the latter half of the 1980s, and much as is the case today, funding was really tight. And so, that I said, And then I had the experience that changed my mind toward teaching was a summer internship with SCA, the Student Conservation Association, where I worked as basically a park ranger at a national recreation area in Colorado. And I fell in love with it. Every day I got to go out and talk with people as park rangers do, tell the natural history of the area we were in. It was the Curacani National Recreation Area outside of Gunnison, Colorado. And then one day in the second week I was there, they said, why don't you do one of our evening ranger shows?
Okay.
And in those days, we had 35 millimeter slides, and they had a library of slides about the area. And so I made this presentation about the history of the old Gunnison River, which was one of the great trout streams in America. And then they dammed it up for electricity. And so I was able to talk about the change in ecosystems from a wild river to now you had a series of 3 lakes. And I loved it, and people responded really well to it. And I realized, wow, this is kind of what I want to do. I found my calling. Then I realized Park Service work. I saw people I really admired who were amazing, who 20 years into their career were still changing jobs every 6 months because park rangering is seasonal work. And I was like, ooh, I'm not sure I'm too keen on that aspect of it, but I really want to do this. And that's when then a bit of serendipity, Duke started up or re-energized a program that had gone dormant, their Master of Arts in Teaching program. And I realized, wow, I could do this park rangery kind of thing, throughout the school year and have a steady career. And so that tied me into that. And then,
so you stayed at Duke for your Master's of Arts in Teaching, is that correct?
Right, yes. So for me, it wound up being, in essence, like a 3-2 program where after 5 years, I had my Master of Arts in Teaching. I had a full year of student teaching under my belt rather than just the 8 weeks that most people get. And then I kind of cast my net wide and said, let me see what schools are out there. And I was a product in New York City of going to independent schools. And so that's kind of what I looked at. And St. Mark's here in Dallas made me an offer I couldn't refuse. If we had more time, I'd tell you, I think you may remember my story of interviewing and being asked to teach sex ed for my interview lesson. I figured I'd either get the job or get arrested.
Fair enough.
For the record, I got the job.
Yeah. And so this was your first job out of that master's program, and you've been there ever since.
Right. Yeah. And so I've been here 28 years now.
You. So then before we go on any further, just briefly, I know you have a lot of friends and colleagues who teach in a lot of different spheres, independent, public, religious schools. Can you just quickly maybe put St. Mark's School of Texas in the context of the broader landscape of teaching careers?
Okay, yeah. Basically, teaching at a school like St. Mark's, where we are an independent school, what a lot of people would call a private school, we have a lot more freedom and flexibility with our curriculum. One of the things that attracted me to St. Mark's was my department chair at the time, a woman named Stephanie Barta, basically said to me as a totally green, off the turnip truck teacher, come on in, you're going to teach 4 sections of class. She was going to teach the other section, and she basically said, make it your own. Be passionate, be creative. You're going to fall on your face occasionally, and you know what? We'll help you get up, dust you off, and you'll move on. It's not the end of the world when you have a bad day of teaching. Yeah. It'll happen. And having support like that was great, and to know that if I wanted to do something creative and fun, I could do that. And I wasn't teaching to a test other than the tests that, I made up based on what we had done. And so that level of freedom was incredibly empowering. And to know that, there were people there that were going to support you and that you could go to and say, hey, I'm clueless on this. I need some help. And you didn't feel like you were going to be judged and, put in the doghouse for it.
Yeah.
That's not always the case at a lot of other schools. And we are also, by our name, you would guess St. Mark's, we are a religious school. We do have a religious connection in our history, and our students attend chapel twice a week in middle school, but our chapel services are very much non-denominational. It's more about, the sermons are more about live the good life, treat people the way you'd want, golden rule kind of things, rather than proselytizing a particular faith tradition, which is, I like that a lot.
Yeah. And that was actually something maybe we can come back to a little bit. A few different students, when I asked them to submit questions, asked things like the benefit of teaching evolution to young students, specifically in the context of, I think, what they assumed was a Christian school setting, or your opinions on teaching evolution somewhere where people have very strong religious beliefs.
Right. Okay.
But before we dig into that, so you've touched on this a little bit. Some people specifically were curious what made you go into teaching as opposed to other fields of biology, why teaching as opposed to a PhD. You've started to teach about this, or to talk about this, but what do you think the best and worst parts of being a biology teacher are? What's your favorite parts of your job, and then the less favorite parts?
The best part for me, and I work with primarily middle school students. I occasionally, some years, will teach high school. But the thing that I love about it is I get students who are kind of uncontaminated from where a lot of your students are. So many times I'll say, "Oh, I'm a biology teacher," and people say, "Oh, I hated biology," and then I hear their sad stories of how they were forced to memorize every living species on the planet for some test.
We just finished a unit on the tree of life, so I'm sure many of my students are rolling their eyes and saying, "Yep."
But so I love the idea. I am not a big fan of memorize the world, but rather let's get the facts we need to scaffold the big ideas.
Yep.
And getting to see students start to make connections between different realms of biology and being able to say, "Oh, wait, I get this because we did something else, 2 weeks ago or a month ago." That is a huge level of excitement for me.
Yeah.
And so that with a younger age group, you get that excitement. And I joke with my students that I could come into class unprepared and just say, "Hey, let's talk about biology, pick a topic and let's go."
Yeah.
And with younger students, they have the willingness to ask the questions that a lot of times we lose as we go through high school, college, and the like. And that is something that feeds me as a teacher tremendously.
Yeah, for sure.
I'd say the thing I am most disappointed about in teaching is really I'll go and tell people, especially other colleagues, professional colleagues, "Oh, you're kind of just a teacher," and you battle that perception.
Yeah.
And I love my teaching, and there are very few other things I would ever want to do. But the feeling that oh, well, you don't have a PhD, so and I've made it a point to go out and talk with folks who are doing biological research and say, it is important for you as researchers to be aware of what's going on in classrooms. And so I've made it a point for myself to try to make a bridge between researchers and classroom teachers so that we can make both aware of the other and pull to the strengths of both sides.
Yeah, no, that's great. And that's actually a nice transition. I mentioned to my class that you've been blogging for National Geographic, and I pointed out your YouTube channel. There is nothing, I'm a family of teachers, so obviously the whole "just a teacher" is a phrase that I don't like. But you do much more than classroom teaching. So could you talk a little bit about all of the stuff that you do outside of the classroom, maybe even outside of St. Mark's, that keeps your specific biological passions going?
Sure. Yeah, that is as I look back at my career, which I said earlier, I've been around for 28 years. When I started off, when I was a young teacher, I was very much focused on my life within the St. Mark's school setting.
Yes.
I didn't reach out beyond our walls very much. It just never really occurred to me because I had didn't have any mentors that did that. As a student, I was never really aware of any of my, say, lower school, middle school, high school teachers ever. They were just teachers and they were part of the class, and that was, did they have lives beyond that? God, no. And so that was how I started off. And then probably for me, the big thing was I wound up having the luck of having some big names come to visit. And, I had the joy of having Jane Goodall in my classroom, which was just incredible. I could go on for hours about that. She made a big difference in how I taught. I had Richard Leakey came and spoke. I had Louise Leakey in my class she taught my classes for 2 days. That was pretty amazing. I had Bob Bacher of the Dinosaur Heresies one day. And I thought that this was amazing. And then what I didn't realize, and this goes to an issue of my own privilege being where I am, is that it finally hit that, wow, I was incredibly lucky. And I'd tell these stories to people, and I had someone at one point say, "Wow, you're just name dropping." which was not my intention at all. But it was like this slap across the face of, I've been luckier than anyone I could imagine. What am I doing to bring that in some way that I can to other people?
Yeah.
And becoming aware of that. And then in 2012, my connection with Lee Berger, which I imagine you've mentioned to your students. So we became friends on Facebook, and I always joke that I must have friended him, and that for some reason he made a mistake and clicked yes instead of no, because here it is, he's Lee Berger and I'm an unknown quantity there. But so once I developed that relationship, the fact that I realized, wow, my passion for human origins and knowing him, and then he modeled something for me that was very important. In 2013, he invited me to come visit his lab in Johannesburg, and I got to go. Again, benefit of the privilege of where I am. And on the very first morning, he arrived at my hotel at 6 a.m. to pick me up. He could have had a graduate student.
Sure.
There was, and immediately I was aware that there's a generosity of spirit here that doesn't have to be there.
Yeah. And
within an hour, I found myself in his office as part of a staff meeting, and I was welcomed. And I was talking with, if any of your students know John Hawks from the University of Wisconsin, one of the great bloggers in human origins. He was there, and I was on the Howard Wolowitz of the group. If you're a Big Bang fan, I don't have my PhD, and yet I was welcome to the group, and I realized.
But you weren't treated as just a teacher.
Right, exactly. I was actually, the idea of that team is open access to the fossils. At that point, they were working with Australopithecus sediba, and the idea was anyone who has a valid scientific reason to want to see our fossils should have that opportunity.
Yeah.
And we're not going to be gatekeepers in that way.
Yeah.
And so here I was, even though, I'm a biology, just a biology teacher, I wasn't treated that way. I had full access to the fossils, and they made sure they were careful with me as far as, okay, I didn't have the experience in handling them, and they don't want damage to them. Right. But, I was fully, anything I asked for pretty much I got to do and explore. Yeah. And that then led to the fact that when Homo naledi is discovered in 2013, again, I have access to the team, so they allow me to, do the Twitter play-by-play that I created. I get invited back in 2015 to interview all the major members of the exploration team. And that's, something then that I said, okay, here's my privilege. I'm going to go out and share this with everyone I can.
Yep.
And so that's basically what I've been up to, and that led to the National Geographic blogging. It led to getting to really know a whole lot of other people that I never would have had a chance to know. So we always hear it's in giving that we receive, and I have gotten so much because I've been willing to go out and interact with people and say, here's what this is.
Yeah, that's really interesting. This is why don't we switch gears a little bit and dig more into that specific process. A few of my students wanted to know, why is Homo naledi such a big deal, which makes me think I did a horrible job in class earlier this week. Maybe you can help me out a little bit. Why was this whole Homo naledi thing such a big deal?
Oh, I can. There's several levels I will hit this from. There's the kind of the biological anthropological side of it, and then there's forget about the actual bones that were discovered, the way in which this project has gone forward, regardless of the interest in the bones. So if I take a quick tag on the biological side, it's so interesting, one, because as a new species, it allows us to see that human origins, again, we fight with this idea from the 1950s and all, that the chain of progress and that linear idea. That's, excuse me, my phone's ringing, just let it go. So instead of just the linear progression, the idea of human evolution as a messy, bushy situation, and Berger and the team, they've since 2013, they've talked about it as a braided stream.
Mm.
And genetically, that the more we learn with new genomes, that seems to be a very apt kind of idea. That you and I like to think of human evolution probably more in the term of populations rather than true species. You
Yep.
have isolated populations who are going to diverge genetically from one another,
Yep.
and then at different times are going to re-encounter each other. And so you're going to have that interbreeding between those populations rather than trying to think of them as species. But of course, if you discover a new bone, I've got some new bones here. Okay, I've got, for my career, I need to name a new species. So I guess I tend to be more of a lumper than a splitter, but yeah,
Yeah.
that's another discussion for.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I would say, I think for some of my students who maybe don't have much background in human origins, this is some of the first stuff they've seen. So they don't have the context of that background of these decades of this mindset of this linear progression and one species, next species, next species.
Right. And and part of it is we had this linear one, then another, then another, it was, Australopithecus afarensis gives rise to Homo habilis, to Homo erectus, Neanderthals, modern humans. And the more species we have, over 20 species now, the more information we have, we can see that the story wasn't as simple as it was when we only had a couple species. So with few data points, you connect them the only way as you can. The more data points you bring into the storyline, it necessarily gets more complex, and you have a wider range of options to consider in your analysis.
So one thing that a few students asked about that I didn't touch on in class was what type of evidence, so other than like brain size, do we know anything about how intelligent, like how intelligent Homo naledi might have been, or any evidence for complex emotions? Like, how do scientists start to answer those questions other than just measuring how big the brain was? Good,
yeah. Ideally, the thing you would really like, and we don't have for Homo naledi, you'd love to have the signs of culture, stone tools being a great example. We know anatomically Naledi's hands were excellent for stone tool use. That being said, they could have used stone tools and fashioned them based on their anatomy. Do we have evidence that supports them actually doing that? Not yet. And that the team is still working in the cave. They're actually down there right now as we speak. And more on that later in the how the project is run side of things. Sure. But the anatomy is there. We're looking for more evidence. So just because we don't have evidence doesn't mean that didn't exist.
Yeah.
The big thing in looking at behavior with Naledi is the fact of where they were discovered. In this Dinaledi chamber, and now a second chamber on a different part of the cave called the Lassetti chamber. And for modern cavers with modern equipment, it takes, and who know where they're going, it takes the better part of 40 minutes to get to that Dinaledi chamber. Down through, and I imagine you've talked about it, down through the 8-inch chute. And so here you now have over 15 bodies in this space, and they were put there. We're talking 260 to 330,000 years ago in that time frame. So they have no modern technology. What are they doing there? And there's no geological evidence to suggest the cave was appreciably easier to get into in those days. That's a whole nother long story I'd be happy to students want to deal with. But you look in, so what are these skeletons doing in that space? Yeah. And you rule out all the other things that are logical. Predators, did water move the bones? Yeah. And just I'm giving the quick answer to all those is no. And so the hypothesis you're really left with, a hypothesis of last resort, is that they were deposited there deliberately and repeatedly. There's evidence it was not just a one-off, they all got there on the same day kind of thing, but probably over generations is what the time frame looks like.
And so you could speculate on the reason for why they might do that, but any of those reasons imply some amount of intelligence, emotion, culture, that kind of thing.
Right, exactly. And then, and so, the question is, why were they doing it? That's a whole different, that gets more into the world of cultural anthropology. And the team is in there trying to get clues, is there evidence of fire in the cave at that time period? Okay. were these individuals using fire? Is that a tool they had access to? Certainly fire is in the general fossil record by that point, but whether they're using it or not, we still don't have that that information. But and this, I'm going to make the jump now into how the project is run. One of the neat things is a lot of times human origins has been, you discover, bones, you discover, these skulls, and it's kind of a descriptive science. For many generations, it wasn't thought of as a hypothesis-driven science. It was you find some bones and you make a claim as to what they are, and there's no, how do you test these claims? Well, now you have Naledi in this chamber, and the question becomes, how did they get down there? And the logical thing is, they came down the chute. And you had these bodies that were articulated, they were all intact. And so, and the initial 2013 dig happened about 10 meters away from the bottom of the chute. And the thought was the bodies had been dropped. There was a kind of a debris cone under the chute. And so the idea was the bodies landed there and then slumped over to where they were eventually excavated. So that, one thing you say is, well, if they were being dumped down there, there should be Homo naledi bones at the base of the chute. And so the team has been this past fall, and they came back just this month, and they're excavating that debris cone, and they're finding lots of naledi stuff in there. Okay. So that's a case of trying to, they're trying to disprove their hypothesis of, they came down the chute. Well, they're getting support for they did come down the chute. And then a thing they've discovered, and they're talking about it, so I get to talk about it, is further away. We're now talking maybe 30 meters from the that cone, where there's no gravitational, slumping. They're finding new Homo naledi bones in very narrow chambers. We're talking too narrow for modern humans to get in.
Wow. They're
finding bones in these odd spaces back there that they know are dead ends, so it's not like they're the entrance points.
Huh.
But how are these bones getting that far over there? And there's, again, in the cave, there's no mechanism of water movement or anything. And so the hypothesis that's starting to develop is, did Homo naledi come down into that chamber alive? And then they were able to move around in there, and then they die further away. So that is, a fascinating thing that will need to be worked out over time. So
am I understanding you correctly that now they're thinking maybe not just a burial chamber, but they were actually doing something active in the chamber and died during that process, which is why they might have been in those faraway locations?
That is the very early stages of the hypothesis on that. So, that, again, it brings in a whole range of new questions there. Sure. And the neat thing is, and I think in science, as teachers, we have to be careful. This is about asking the questions, not just about the end answers. Yeah. We'll get there eventually. Yeah. But, the fact that we enjoy the questions. So, and then another aspect with this team that I love, and one of my National Geographic blog articles is about why every science classroom should be learning about Homo naledi. And it's not just about the bones, but if you look at how this team was assembled, you had a world-class paleoanthropologist in Lee Berger who realized he can't get down the chute, where he and I are both, we joke, physiologically inappropriate. Basically, we're too heavy, as a polite way of saying it. And so he makes use of social media, which is something science up until fairly recently had been kind of, whoa, maybe not. Yep. And he puts out I'm sure you've probably talked about the Skinny Scientist ad.
Yep.
And, he gets his team of 6 women who do an amazing job there. And they've come back several times now to continue the dig work. And I've gotten to know them really well, and they're just a fascinating group. But so you have here a senior male scientist who's saying, hey, I have younger people who can do the job really well. And the fact that, gender is really not playing an issue in this. I think that, that plays a big role. And then the next thing is, so they got a lot of treatment for that, and people got so excited, they're all women. But we also need to remind that, no, they're all really qualified to do it. And that's something that I think sometimes gets lost in the discussion there.
Yeah.
And then, so you have initially 1,500 bones that come in. How are you going to process all those? Because that's the largest fossil discovery in all of Africa up to that point.
Okay.
And so then the deal is, a small group of senior scientists might take 15 years to do that. Instead, what Berger and Hawks decided to do is, let's invite the young tenure track PhD folks who have good data on various topics. Let's invite them in and let's work in a workshop setting for a month. And so they invited several dozen individuals and basically gave each of them the body part that they were expert in. So there was the hand group, the foot group, the spine group, the skull group, and so on.
Yep.
And they basically went through this whole collection, and they had a chance to hash it all out.
And that's how they were able to publish relatively rapidly.
Right. And then they were able to, to brainstorm and use really the hive mind of this large group all in the same place for an extended period at the same time. And that is something, new, to open things up and say, yeah, we want people, we want differing ideas, we want a diversity of opinion and background.
That's interesting. I see a parallel to the telepresence marine exploration vessels that I've been sort of tangentially involved with, where it's not, this is my research cruise and I'm doing my dives, but now that we have ship to shore cable, we can have live streaming video, and if there's a new coral, we can call the world's coral experts and within 5 minutes see, get their opinion. And so I see that sort of opening out and using technology to sort of make the science discovery process more open access. I see that happening at least in the deep sea as well.
Yeah, and one aspect of this that comes up is, prior to Sediba and Naledi being discovered, you could take pretty much all of the bones from the hominid fossil history of Africa and fit it in a couple of shoeboxes. So fossils were precious. And so the idea of, if I do my Gollum, my precious, I have my fossil I've discovered, that's my meal ticket to a career. Yeah. The longer I can hold on to this, the better it is for me. It's not necessarily good for the science. Now, the fossils are so plentiful in these discoveries that really, to do the science justice, you need to open it up. And that's been something, and if you hear people who are, going to criticize Berger, that's one of the things that the old guard doesn't care for about his style, is that, he's bringing in, new people, untested people. How can we trust their analysis? Those are kind of the questions that are going in. And you look at every other branch of science now, and especially if you look at genetics, the younger folks in the field are the ones that are driving a lot of the new innovation and new way of thinking. Yeah. And you know what? If you get a hypothesis wrong, it's not the end of the world. Science corrects itself. Right. And we, as a self-correcting field, that's an important thing. So if you screw up, science is ideally there to, you have enough eyes looking at you and saying, nope, you've messed up. Here's the way to go.
Especially when it's that open and there's so many people thinking about the same problem.
Right. And especially now that they're now taking the project and connecting it with, they put Wi-Fi in the cave now, so that literally they can talk to each other as they're doing it. But kind of like you were saying on your ship stuff, hey, we've got this, what's this? Or, archaeologically, how do we process getting these fragments out? They can have those discussions anywhere in the world. Just at St. Mark's last year, earlier this year, this fall, we Skyped in 300 middle schoolers. We were in Deckard, just, you know the place. Yeah. And we were in the Dinaledi and Lassetti chambers live. That's right. And one of the 7th graders asked a question, how often when you're doing this work are you actually finding new fossils? And as he asked the question, one of the researchers, Ellen, said, well, I've just found one right now. And it was a fragment of rib bone. Wow. And it was right there in the moment. That's so, nice. Talk about getting students excited about science in general, but this field in particular, there you go. And then the plan now is that they are going to be putting cameras in 24/7 so that people can, on your lunch break, you want to go see what's going on, and, potentially have interaction with the team that way.
And it makes me think broadly about, entering the profession of teaching now. These technologies are being expanded. So whether or not your thing is human evolution or the deep sea, I anticipate that the process of research is going to become more and more open, and there's going to be more and more opportunities for teachers to access that process through these technologies that are becoming more available and cheaper.
Absolutely. You know, something I haven't used with my students, although I'm fascinated by it, is and you probably, I'm going to butcher the name, but the Oikos dives.
Yeah.
You familiar with those? So you know their lives.
Okeanos.
Okeanos. Thank you. Yeah. They're
my deep sea biology class just submitted a couple of dive site proposals for their upcoming cruise.
Awesome. Yeah. And so the idea that, you know, the live streaming of their ROV stuff.
Exactly.
You know, wow. You know, so you can have students discovering stuff kind of on their own by seeing that, you know, and again, it becomes less about, and this is what appeals to my style, less about memorizing and more about thinking and connecting.
Yeah. Yeah. Just before I forget, you've been flashing these bones around. In case any of my students are wondering why you have these precious bones in your office, can you tell us what they are?
Yeah. First of all, these are all casts. So let's but let's see. We'll start with this one here is Australopithecus sediba, and it was a gift. It's a cast. It was a gift to me by Lindsay Hunter, one of the underground astronauts, when she came to visit our St. Mark's in 2014. After they had just gotten back from South Africa, she spent a day with us, and her great demand of us was that she get pizza with the students. We were happy to oblige. So that's Sediba. And then when Berger came and made the announcement of Homo naledi in Dallas in 2015, he donated to St. Mark's one of the first skulls of Homo naledi. So he's the only person to yeah, it's a cast. Yeah, there's no way that the South Africa will not allow actual fossils out of country. Yep. Back in the colonial days, that was an issue throughout Africa, and so African governments are very, very tight on their fossils. But this was one of the first casts in the United States after the announcement. Yep. So, and he surprised me by giving this to me in front of 300 middle school boys, and it's the only time I've cried in front of 300 people without someone dying. So, and arguably, well, Naledi had to die for me to get my hands on this. But. And then one also, this is one of the Homo naledi feet. Complete feet in the fossil record are unheard of until recently, and because of the nature of the fossilization and the limited space with the cave, you have articulated, fully complete feet.
And is that to scale?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yep. So you can see, just if you want to compare it to my hand, you get an idea there. So very, you know, very human but smaller.
Yeah. Okay. Great. I want to let me see if I missed any of my students' questions. I think you touched on a lot of it without me specifically having to ask. Any advice for what advice do you have for someone at the undergraduate stage who may or may not be considering, who thinks maybe teaching is appealing, but what do I do? How do I know if it's for me?
One thing that I would recommend is have them, if you're at this stage of your education, you're in college, you're clearly learning is important to you. And part of that has been the teachers you've had in your experience. Go back and talk to your former teachers. Find out ask them, what's great about teaching, what are the challenges, and have those conversations. And the neat thing is we as teachers are almost always eager to see people come and talk to us and ask those questions. And especially if they're former students. Yeah. That is something that, and I love the fact that I'll have my former students come back on, usually during holidays and say, hey, let's go out and, have a meal, and I get to get caught up with them, but they're just as interested in, hey, how is your teaching changing? What's different now than when I was in your class 15 years ago, kind of thing. Yeah. And that keeps both of us fresh that way. Yeah. But definitely talking with teachers is a really, really critical thing. And even talking to teachers you might get to meet who are in schools that were different from the ones you grew up in. I think that's helpful too.
Yeah, fair enough. Oh, I know the one other thing, I don't want to take too much more of your time, but we've been talking a lot about hominid evolution, but you're also really passionate about teaching evolution more broadly.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk a little bit about everything you've done, about some of your work in helping teachers teach evolution, or the sort of your activism in terms of making sure evolution gets taught better and better?
Yeah, that's and being here in Texas, everyone immediately assumes that it's somewhere written into the state laws that evolution is illegal.
Right.
It's not, by the way, and I will play up on that sometimes I will introduce myself to a group of folks and I say, "Hi, my name's John. I teach evolution in Texas," and that often will get a gasp or chuckle from an audience, especially of teachers.
Sure.
And the thing that I've always been frustrated about from the early days of my my high school days is that people weren't teaching evolution because they were afraid to. That it's controversial and people tend to shy away from things they see are controversial. So what's happened is the teaching of evolution is generally pretty poor across the American world, in large part because, and it's a cycle of, it's controversial, so teachers shy away from it, and politicians and school boards have not pushed the idea of teaching evolution. In many cases, just the opposite. And so as a result, the next generation isn't taught it in a robust way that ties in the way that we would teach other ideas. So as a result, you have teachers now who didn't get much background in it,
right,
and they want to avoid it because they feel it's potentially controversial. So do I understand that you don't want to teach something you feel kind of on as far as content and it's controversial? No, I understand why people aren't teaching that. So I take it as my part going out to conferences and basically saying, here are ways you can approach it so that, one, it's not controversial. You don't have to come into evolution as I'm an anti-religion kind of zealot, because being a zealot on either side is counterproductive. And then for me, teaching evolution and tying it to all the other aspects of biology is really, really helpful. So, in my classes, a big part of it is it's woven through, we're talking about heart anatomy. Well, there's an evolutionary aspect of that. How do mammal hearts differ from bird hearts, from reptile hearts, and so on. And so you weave it in that way, and it doesn't come across as controversial and anti anything. And then and I deal with younger students primarily, so they tend to ask me genuine questions about, well, how does Adam and Eve relate to this? And, some of the biblical stuff that they've learned. And for the most part, people aren't trying to teach them anti-evolution. This is the culture they've grown up in, and their various faith traditions, and, saying, well, and most students need to understand the difference between science as a way of knowing, our nature of science, and then, a religious viewpoint, whatever your faith tradition happens to be, and what religion attempts to do. And you find out that they're not at each other's throats. They're different ways of understanding the world.
Yeah.
And once people understand that, it makes evolution, much more reasonable for them.
Yeah.
Yeah. But there are challenges. I was presenting last year in Lubbock, Texas, to a bunch of teachers. And I had one teacher who said, she had been brought in front of her school board in a small West Texas town because the president of the school board quoted saying, "Don't you realize you're threatening the salvation of our children by teaching evolution?" So that kind of Scopes monkey trial mentality is still out there in places and is a real challenge. The person who was hosting it was the district science coordinator for that part of Texas.
Right.
And we had a workbook that we had for the teachers, and on the back we had a little shout out to her. And we said, thanks to Melissa for making this possible, da da da. She saw that we're 20 minutes before the start of things, getting everything set up. She saw that and she said, we need to get scissors and we need to cut that out. I appreciate you giving me a shout out, but if this gets handed up the line to a state legislator, who's anti-evolution, they could have my job, even though teaching evolution is part of the official Texas curriculum.
Yeah.
So just it tends to be ignored a little bit more than other parts.
Right.
But so that is still out there, and those battles still need to be addressed.
Yep.
So
great. Well, I think this has been awesome. I think I really appreciate your time, and I think, whether my students are at all interested in teaching or not, I think we've talked about a lot of different things related to stuff we're talking about in class in different ways. So I really appreciate that. I appreciate everything you do for, sharing your passion and your science with all the rest of us.
Cool. Well, I appreciate the invitation, and it's always great to reconnect. And I'll throw the offer out to your students, even though this is a fairly long discussion we've had, but if any of you guys out there are interested in learning more, you can get my information or follow me and message me on Twitter. I'm at @evo_explorer. I'm happy to interact there. So don't hesitate. And my email is mead@smtexas.org. I'm happy to field questions and stuff that way.
Great. I really appreciate that, John.
Thanks.
All right. Take care.
Have a good one. Happy Friday.
All right. So I just stopped the video. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
You are welcome. That was fun.
I'm still recording. Hold on.